Hello. I don't mean to brag, but I have had the honor of meeting some of the most beautiful women in the world. I met them doing fashion photography, naturally. These women were grandmothers, women of silver hair, with braids and ribbons, well-earned wrinkles, and fashions generations deep. I spent 2 years making photographs of people in their look. But not just any people, not just any look. My focus was quite specific. There's a state in the south of Mexico called Oaxaca where I've spent half my life. And though Oaxaca isn't particularly large, it's tremendously diverse. Among the original inhabitants of Oaxaca, there are 16 languages that are spoken. And in the villages of Oaxaca, old ways of being human, old ways of doing persist. And in some of these communities, there's a tradition, a custom of dress and adornment that I call community fashion, which was once common around the world and now has become incredibly rare. Community fashion is a way of dressing shared in common by members of a town or a village, a collective identity, and oftentimes the clothing is made by the very people of those communities. And into that clothing are worked designs rich with symbols and meaning that have been dreamed into being over the generations. Stories in cloth that, like language, are dynamic and slowly evolving. These were the people that I wanted to recognize with my photography, and theirs was the look that I wanted to honor. And so I traveled the breadth and the width of this state of Oaxaca, looking for every single village I could find where people still dressed in the clothing of their village, where it survived or even thrived. And all told, I found 57 different communities, 57 different ways of dressing and expressing yourself through your clothing, and created more than 200 portraits. But before I share any of these with you, I need to make a little confession as I stand here and speak to you about this fashion-focused photographic project here at the Fashion Institute of Technology in NYC. And that is that fashion wasn't really the focus of this photographic project. And I think I can explain what my motives were by answering this simple question. And the question is, what does a sagebrush know that the tumbleweed doesn't? Now, if you know the answer, don't give it away. You know it, don't you? It goes something like this. I was born in Reno, Nevada. My mother was born in Los Angeles, California. My father was born in Novato, California. My mother's father was born in Oklahoma. My father's mother was born in Chicago. Their parents, my great-grandparents, I don't know where they were born. But my father studied university in Reno, which is where he met my mother, and that's how I came to be there. Neither of them live there anymore. I studied university in Arcata, California. I don't live there anymore either. And as I look at this recent snapshot of my family history, what I see are so many tumbleweeds blowing in the wind. A tumbleweed is a kind of nomadic plant. It takes root in a certain piece of soil, grows for a period of time, and then when the right gust of wind comes along, where the trunk meets the soil, it breaks off at the roots and begins its tumbling ways. Now, here in America, I don't think the tumbling ways of my family are particularly unusual. Many of us are born in one place and have moved on to another for one reason or another. But something that I've always wondered is, what would it be like to really be from a place? I mean, in a sense, I kind of know, because of course I am from a place. I was born on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains and grew up in these long desert valleys carpeted by this iconic western plant called sagebrush, where the summer rains would come down and meet the shimmering heat coming off the soil and invigorate this sweet and pungent smell of that sagebrush, this perfume of the earth. I swear, if they ever open up my heart for some reason, that's what it's going to smell like. This smell of summer rain on sagebrush. That place has marked me forever, perhaps in the way that a birth creek would mark the salmon. But I was only a tumbleweed there, dropped into place by another tumbleweed, and soon enough my fast-growing trunk broke off at the roots, and I began my tumbling way. But all around me grew that sagebrush, firmly rooted to to its place on earth. And I wonder, what does the sagebrush know that the tumbleweed doesn't? What would it be like to have roots that firmly go into the soil and keep you there, feeding off the nutrients of that place? What would it be like to be from a place where your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents were from? People who intimately knew the hills and valleys and neighborhoods around and depended on those hills and valleys and neighbors for their well-being. What would it be like to grow up fed on the generational stories and legends of this place on earth that you were from? And what if the food on your plate came from that land around you, as much a part of it as your mother's voice was a part of you? And what if the language that your mother spoke, your language, was an echo of this unique corner of earth, a language of a grand extended community? Clothing would be that way too. Going far enough back, the clothing you wore would have been a direct offshoot of the land. Was it made of cotton or wool, silk or sisal? And would your clothing, like the food on your plate, the stories of the old-timers, the language that you spoke, become another symbol that connected you to a people and a place? Like a flag that you wear over your shoulders or draped around your hips. A flag that says, I am of we, and we are of here. What kind of sense of self with such a clear connection to place and family and community give you? What would that be like? This is a question I've silently asked myself for my entire life. Or maybe more accurately, inside there has been this yearning, this sense of hunger, a loss of something that I never even had. Something that is only defined by a negative space inside of me. And it is this hunger, this sense of loss, that is the genesis of this photographic project. Because isn't it true that when we have a hunger, we try to feed ourselves? And for me, the clearest, most beautiful way to represent this somewhat intangible thing called heritage or belonging, these roots, is through photography of traditional people in the clothing they wear. People who understand belonging and connection the way I understand breathing. So it may seem like the focus of this project is fashion. But for me, it's not so much about how people dress, but what is symbolized by dressing in a way that is shared in common with the members of your village or town, where clothing becomes a flag of belonging, a clear statement of being from a place and a history. And a beautiful, woven, artistic link to ancient and deep skills, imbued with story and meaning. And where in each and every one of these rooted communities, one's parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were also from there, knowing that they were part of an extended family, this oldest and most perfect human support network. And likewise, members of an interwoven community. Shazam. Connected to this grand network, to this support circle. Places, by the way, where there's great food. One of the bennies of a good community. To be born into a place like this where so many generations of your ancestors have lived is to live in layer upon layer of stories. The fertile compost of layer upon layer of stories. Generations of being and experience. The duff of lifetimes enriching your roots. Bam. I met Juana Bautista in a village called San Pablo Ticaltepec. And she told me stories about her clothing. She said, I learned to make my clothing from my mother, and she learned from her mother before her. And she paused and she looked me in the eyes and she said, you know, I guess my clothing is my memory. And in the town of Tehuantepec, I met Fernanda Sanchez, who was a colonel in the Mexican army for decades. And when she retired and she moved back to her town where she had grown up, she said, to come back and put on our clothing was like slipping back into my skin. What a beautiful sentiment. I photographed Socorro Paulina at a holy place on the outskirts of her village of Pinotepe de Don Luis, surrounded by sacred symbols. She's wearing a pozohuanco, a kind of skirt iconic of that community, that she wove herself from cotton and silk. And she said, we're married and buried in our best pozohuancos. At her side, a cross emblematic of a religion brought to Mexico by the Spaniards in the 1500s. And behind her grows a ceiba tree. In the ancient times in Mexico, the ceiba tree was considered the tree of life, a very sacred symbol, with the roots growing into the loamy soil, the realm of ancestors and spirits, and the trunk representing the human world, and those upward-reaching branches, the home of the gods. And there she stands with her bare feet on the ground, her bare feet touching her one sacred place on earth, those feet in this sacred place on earth. And there were stories of change and stories of loss. In many communities, commercial clothing, store-bought clothing is replacing traditional clothing. And there are reasons for that. One of them might be that commercial clothing is cheaper. It might be more comfortable. It might be perceived as being hipper. It might even be better made. But also, to be indigenous in Mexico, like in so many places in this world, is to be subjected to discrimination. And to put on the costume of the outside world is to avoid some of that discrimination. And yet there is a soul-soothing pride in wearing the clothing of your community. And it was expressed to me again and again and again. But in spite of that, it is disappearing. In this town of Yalalag, I found 40 women who still dressed in the way of their village. And in Solaga, there were only 4. And when it's gone, in 2/3 of the 57 villages that I visited, the only people I could find who still dressed in the clothing of their community were the grandmothers. By the time their daughters were born, the fast-moving outside world had come in, and things had begun to change. These beautiful grandmothers of silver hair and braids and ribbons with well-earned wrinkles, wearing fashions deeply rooted, may very well be the last generation in these communities to dress in these flags of their community. For me, their beauty stems from many things, not the least of which is that they carry within their collective experience the unspoken knowledge of old, rooted ways of being human. They are, quite literally, the grandmothers of the human world, the wise old ones. And they're beginning to die. What is lost? What is lost when you no longer wear the clothing that represents your own deep history? When the food on your plate has become generic? When the language that you spoke, the intonations of your parents and your grandparents is extinct? Does it even matter? Are these just old-fashioned relics in a modern world? Maybe so. But perhaps with the loss, a yearning appears, a hunger that grows over the generations. And where once there was something, a long-forgotten birthright called connection and belonging, once there was something, but you can't quite name it. And it's only defined by a negative space inside, an emptiness. I think of the ceiba tree, once so revered by the people of Mexico, with its roots firmly anchored to the soil and its strong trunk and those upward-reaching branches. One can think of the earth as history, composed of eroded stone and life that has been, decayed leaves and trunks, in the expired hearts of every living being, that which was the past. And those roots go down into that and feed off of that fertile compost of layer upon layer of being an experience, recycling that energy back into the present again. The past is the food of tomorrow. And at the opposite extreme of the branches, reaching upwards, reaching for the stars, and specifically for our most important star, the sun, reaching for that golden power, reaching for the potential, reaching out into thin air, reaching for some unknown future. And the two are connected by the trunk, this conduit of these very different sources of energy, a link between those grounding roots and those upward reaching branches. And of course, the whole creates a perfect balance. Those of us here in this room, wrapped up in this bedazzling and astounding journey called modern Western civilization, I think of us like the branches, reaching upwards towards that potential, towards possibility, towards some unknown tomorrow, reaching into thin air, looking and searching, reaching for that golden potential. But I believe we've forgotten our roots. I share this story for the beautiful grandmothers and the grandfathers, and for all the people around the world who are part of this chorus of so many languages and the rich and singular and idiosyncratic ways of dressing and eating and gathering. I share this for the people who our fast-moving world has overlooked or, worse, overrun. For the grandmother cultures. For those who still remember the old, slow-learned lessons about belonging to this very precious gift called Earth and connection to each other. From my tumbleweed roots to my sagebrush-scented heart, I thank the people of Oaxaca for all that they have taught me. We need you, you who are the deep and solid roots in the loamy soil. And perhaps if we can be humble and quiet and listen, their layers of knowledge can help our collective tree from falling over. And I share this for you, for us. What is the sin of your heart? Where do your feet touch the soil? Remember. Thank you.